do that.
Okay, go ahead, Pat. I'll turn it over to you. And I did put a revised agenda in the chat, which I'll drop one more time, and we can speak to the changes that occurred this morning.
Great. So welcome, everybody. Nice to see everybody. Sorry I missed the last meeting. I watched the video and there's lots of good stuff that got covered. Okay, so we had a last minute change at 10 o'clock last night. So our presenters had a change that could not make it this morning. So what we want to do is reschedule that for as soon as possible. So first, just to let you know, we want to have those same speakers kind of follow on to the broader questions around forestry and working forests and private lands and the importance of kind of keeping working lands working and what they need to do that. So we're going to recircle back on that as soon as possible. Jane, you had thought of maybe a possible date. Is that correct? Do you want to just toss that out as an idea?
Yeah, I currently at our last meeting, we talked about, oh, Richard's able to join us. That's great. At our last meeting, we added a new meeting for the 14th, which we'll talk through some of the upcoming presenters on that date and how we accommodate a robust meeting on that date. But we were holding September 7th for a smaller group to consider drafting and meeting. So I'd like to just propose, and I'll work with Billy and others to reschedule to see if that date can work, that the morning of September 7th, if that works for the group collectively, that would be what we were striving for. And
just in chat, if September 7th doesn't work for one of the members of the working group here, just put it in chat, let us know, just so we have a sense of that as we kind of sort this out. Okay, so sorry for the last minute change. We were a little surprised too, but here we are. So what we want to do today is talk a little bit about, I think you all had mentioned in a smaller group met to think about how we engage the affected community around, particularly McNeil, but maybe Reigate, I don't know, around kind of listening sessions and the like. And they had a conversation, and I think are having a bit of a reframing of that. So Jane and others can share about that work. And then what we do want to do is do a little planning again for the 14th, where if you remember, we kind of started the conversation broadly from the UVM professor about kind of biomass and wood flows and what it really means for carbon. And we did some of that, and then we kind of dove into many of the issues around air quality and sort of sourcing for the two plants. And then we're starting to broaden that out with forestry questions that folks will cover in our rescheduled meeting. And then we want to bring some other folks in to come back to kind of the first question around biomass broadly, right? Because our two tasks are kind of specifically the McNeil Reigate plant and impacts and effects, and then broadly biomass in the picture of climate and carbon. So the thought is for the 14th, we want to bring some additional presenters people have suggested to kind of round out that conversation, where the end becomes connected to the beginning. And then we want to take a little bit today, and we'll probably close early because of our change here, just about how we're thinking of beginning to draft recommendations for the Full Climate Council, and some thoughts about how we are going to do that and what you all think about that. So that's our plan for today. So any questions about that? Or comments about our kind of redo here?
I'm sorry to jump in without a hand. It's Liz.
No, okay, just you have your own thing.
Related somewhere in that agenda at the cross-sector subcommittee meeting last week, it was raised, I think both in committee discussion as well as public comment, that this group should give some consideration to whether there are priority items to put in the mix with regard to budgeting, funding, research or studies or data collection or other work that would be related to potential recommendations or the subcommittee's work or working groups work more generally, that we should raise up to the Climate Council in September and October.
And Liz, the deadline for that would that be October sometime? What would be the deadline for that?
Discussion in September, decision in October is my remembrance.
Okay. All right, thanks for that. So we'll have to think as part of both the small kind of drafting group and you all as a whole, we'll have to think about how to try to think about maybe making that happen. Okay. Timing may be a little tricky. But.
I think, yeah, Liz's point is a good one. And we might want to actually revise the revised agenda, and just let me give a brief contextual update to what Liz is mentioning and the process that cross-sector proposed to have input from task groups. So yeah.
We can toss that in the agenda today. Is that all right with everybody? We'll toss that in. Liz, thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you.
But okay, we'll toss it in just a second. Okay. Anything else on the agenda that I just want to approve meeting minutes from the last meeting, and then we'll go from there. Okay, any additions or corrections to the minutes from the 8/10/22 meeting? Any additions or corrections? Okay. Not seeing anybody jumping in. All right, good. Hey, Richard, I just want to make sure, Richard, can you just speak? I want to make sure we can hear you and you can hear us.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Great, sound good. Thanks a lot. Perfect. Okay, so Jane, maybe why don't we start with the cross-sector and the process piece that Liz just brought up, then we'll go to the listening sessions, and then we'll go to upcoming meeting.
Sure. So this relates to broader council initiatives that the council itself has been preparing for via the steering committee over the summer to carry forward with the work of the council this fall. The real core work of the Vermont Climate Council this fall is really taking up the biomass recommendations and the transportation recommendations as considerations of addendum to the original climate action plan last year. And then also a second sort of component of the work that they were looking at this fall is to think about budget priorities, as well as, I will say to a lesser extent, hasn't really carried forward the same, but a suite of legislative priorities, knowing that as the climate action plan was adopted last year, there was a high priority set that just sort of ran in the legislature. And so we had been talking through the steering committee, both budgeting as well as legislative priorities, and really where they've landed and been focused is on budget priorities in two sort of areas: one, to further technical analyses, and two, considerations around larger ongoing budget needs to advance CAP climate action plan priorities. And so specifically, the steering committee at their last meeting last Monday heard from Secretary Clauser, the Secretary of Administration, around the governor's timeline for requesting budgets from agencies, and suggested that it would be good timing for the Climate Council to respond similarly to the way state agencies are asked to lift up priorities for the governor to consider in his budget. And that timeline, I think, was maybe shorter than people had expected. And agencies are asked to give the governor their budgets by October 11th this year for him to consider and roll up into his budget. And so the request was that by mid-September, the Climate Council would prepare a memo to the governor and legislative committees, because I think that the implications of the council request or ask goes beyond what the governor might do, could also be influence of how the legislature responds to the governor. So that if we were to be successful in lifting up what those priorities would be at the October council meeting, we would have to have a suite of sort of all the priorities and asks at the September council meeting, which is coming right up and quite a short timeline. So September 12th is the council meeting. And on that agenda, which I can drop in the chat, co-chairs from subcommittees will be given an opportunity to lift up priorities from their subcommittees up to the council for consideration. At the same time, the Agency of Natural Resources will put forward a memo that speaks to our capacity to further deliver on technical assistance and expectations around administrative capacity going forward, as well as our ongoing budget priorities within the climate space. So what are we doing right now for technical analyses? Where do we expect to need more funding and continue into the next fiscal year? So that when the council hears all of those priorities from subcommittees, hears about ANR's capacity, they can delineate a target and a goal for subcommittees to refine those priorities in the month of September, so that in October there would be a final suite of priorities lifted up and prepared for in a memo that would go to the governor and the legislative committees. When cross-sector met last week, it was clear that the main areas of work that they expected to need future funding to advance technical analyses or engagement efforts or anything really, were that from the task groups, and really looked, I think, to, and I wasn't at this meeting, so ask Liz or others who sit on cross-sector, Megan, I think Megan was off too, actually, Liz to speak, and Adam, sorry, others to speak to the clear guidance from cross-sector. But I think at what I learned at the transportation group this week was that there was a request of task groups to consider at a high level what are ongoing needs that you'll see coming. And transportation, in all honesty, is much better prepared to do that because they have a draft set of recommendations, and they can see based on those recommendations where resources are needed to advance those recommendations next year. We're not quite there yet, but we might be able to speculate where we're going and what resources are needed to do so. And then cross-sector scheduled a special meeting on September 7th ahead of the council meeting to hear those recommendations so that the co-chairs could present them up to the council. So that's a sort of long-winded explanation of where we're at with not exactly clear process. You know, this is sort of new territory in that as we're shifting the agency into the standing up of the Climate Action Office and the agency's priorities in climate space, there's a clear need percolating around how the work around process is really going to be lifted up through the council, and really clear needs for facilitation going forward to get the council to be clear to asks of subcommittees and beyond. And that's something that we'll be talking about with CBI and others who help facilitate that with the council for future meetings. But for now, it's really an ask of subcommittees to lift up their priorities as they see it at a very coarse level.
And it seems like there's a challenge between the work we're doing where our recommendations are coming more to a front late September, October versus by the date, but we'll talk about that. So Judy, over to you.
I'm sorry, I have a question. I live in a world of consensus, and everything we do is around consensus. And I'm just curious, what happens if we are not ready? I mean, if we want to continue the path of educating ourselves and then putting everything together, and we explain that to the powers to be, that we need a little more time, is that like, is the house going to tumble down if we do that?
I'm not sure if that's to me, but happy to explain. I don't think that's a problem. I also don't think that it lends itself to just having a budget ask, because that to plug into the governor's process and the legislature, there is a timeline. But I think that's okay. I think we can say that this committee hasn't formulated a consensus around the recommendations or the asks yet, and therefore can't speak to budget requests. Be fine. And that might mean that next year or another time we would have future needs for budgets to continue the work, or it might mean that we're not able to continue the work without money. It's hard for me to speculate, but I don't think there's anything that's pushing down on the task group to draw clear recommendations where they're not ready to yet.
I mean, Jane, just to follow up on Judy. So, I mean, obviously, it's always nice if you can get something into the governor's planning process for his budget. It's an iterative process. The legislature also is the final dispensation of the budget. So there's more work you could do in 2023 early, right, with the legislature if there's asks that you all have at that point. So even though it would be nice to get it in, Jane, to your point, it sounds like that we could continue to work and get something in later, whether it's to the governor or to the legislature. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I like that path because we tabled what Ag and Ecosystems presented, and so we still have lots of research, et cetera, to do. Thank you.
To Judy's point, and kind of time, anybody disagree with Judy's point that we're just not there yet and we need some more time, and we'll, as soon as we can, we'll get forward when we can in that process, but we're not ready today right now. Anybody disagree with that?
I guess I just want to clarify, Judy, are you speaking specifically about budget, or are you speaking more broadly about recommendations? Because I think that's a fine thing to say about, like, are we, because I thought we were trying to speak specifically right now, not about the recommendations, but about where anything that we're starting to see in the work that we've done to date. Is there a clear need at this point for funding to help support that?
Well, I mean, I'm not opposed to saying, hey, here's a ballpark figure, but we can't give you details because we don't have our recommendations together. I mean, how do you ask for money if we don't have a recommendation of what the money's for?
Well, like one thing, I understand your observation, but one thing that we're going to talk about in a minute is the listening session, or the ongoing commitment really that we want to make in the space around the community of McNeil. And we can share with this group the conversation you and I had with David Plum from CBI and Kashka Orlo from the Public Engagement Task Group. And I could see that as a consensus from this group, lifting up into the work of Just Transitions and the Community Engagement and Public Engagement Task Group, an appreciation that we need more resources to do the kind of engagement we want to do, both around climate, but that also feeds into the continuation of the work of this task group for McNeil. So that is one space where I could see us aligning an ask with the engagement group that says we need additional resources to help support the kind of engagement we want to do in that community.
And I agree with that. It's because the result of that will be a recommendation, correct? Right. And if we don't have other recommendations, I'm like, how do we figure a budget on that?
Why don't we do this? Let's actually talk about the listening sessions. Let's talk about the upcoming meeting to kind of, and how we're going to try to begin to draft recommendations. And let's come back to the question Liz raised, the budget question, towards the end of this morning, after we've done a little bit more discussion about our work. Does that make sense? And we can see maybe if there is something in there like community engagement that we want. Okay. So I think that's a good transition. Then Jane, Judy, others, I think the idea was, gee, should we have a listening session with the McNeil community? Because we kind of want to hear from the impacted community as well as the discussions we've had. You all talked, met, and what were your thoughts about what would be the best and just way to actually do that engagement?
Judy, I'm happy to summarize, or if you would like to take the lead on summarizing, happy to defer to you too.
Go right ahead. I'll jump in if I need to. Of course.
I trust that you will. And reminder of Chase and others at Just Transitions, an idea that had come up repeatedly, both in this task group and then at Just Transitions, is the need to sort of hear directly from community members around McNeil specifically. And I think McNeil has been highlighted because of the context in an urban setting, whereas Rygate is a much more rural setting with people not concentrated around it as much. However, I want to check that with all of you. We never really said it outright in our meeting last week, but we definitely focused around McNeil as a group. Kashka Orlo has been a consistent supporter, volunteer through the Just Transition subcommittee on our work with community engagement. She joined us, happens to live in the Old North End as well. And David Plum worked with us, knowing that he's helped facilitate Just Transitions consistently for the work of the council. What I took away from that meeting clearly was that if we were committing to a listening session, we were actually committing to identifying the community in the Old North End as a community that we wanted to work with broadly on climate opportunities and engagement, and that McNeil would be a component of that, but that it was disingenuous to go into that community as a one-off listening session and say, we want to hear from you about what you think about McNeil, when there are broader issues. There's issues of mistrust. There's generational issues around the community being sidelined from conversations and not being listened to. And so that it would not be a successful endeavor to have one listening session where we said, what do you think about the impacts of McNeil in your neighborhood? So we were able to, and it aligns with the work of that our public engagement task group has had a three-pronged approach to engagement. We've been focused on making the climate action plan more accessible to a broad constituent of Vermonters through translation services, through visual documents and more. We've been focused on how we carry out broad-based engagement with Vermonters, and we've been really starting to hone in on what targeted engagement to frontline and impacted communities look like. And so we've been kind of fits and starts with that work, knowing how deep we need to go and the relationships we need to build to do so, and the limited capacity we currently have to do that. I will say in the Climate Action Office, one of the new positions is a community engagement coordinator. And so we expect to have additional resources to really think about how we coordinate that engagement and really take it in and demonstrate to the public how we're using it, which I think has been the disconnect for a long time. And so we got to a place, it was a really great conversation that ranged from making moonshine and brothels in the Old North End. I learned a lot from Judy. Both Kashka and I want to go on a walking tour with Judy at the Old North End, to actually some tangible next steps about actually thinking about what a climate survey would look like and how we would deliver that like peer-to-peer through, and then what the trusted community centers are in the Old North End, like the Boys and Girls Club, as well as the health center. So how we can make a survey, questionnaire, engagement form, lift up issues around climate, resilience, adaptation, emissions, and in that have some questions that would focus in on McNeil and the implications of McNeil, but that we needed to lay the groundwork around climate and what climate change means in the Old North End before we could go right in on McNeil. So that would be a lot of resources in and of itself to deliver that. There were ideas about how Kashka could help support that. She does get a stipend capstone. Sue Mintner, who's a climate counselor, has been successful in bringing money to the table the last year to pay Kashka and Indra, who are two Just Transitions members, to actually help support us in doing engagement through capstone. And so Kashka has some limited capacity to help us with that. We would need money to formulate a survey and what that looked like, and whether it would be informal or whether we would actually want to have it statistically valid, like all sorts of questions about that. And then we would, an in-person event, probably multiples over the time and work closely with the Boys and Girls Club likely to host that, where we would talk about climate and talk about McNeil. But this is not likely on a timeline that would help anything this fall. This is what we learned from this is that if we were going into this community to talk about climate, we were making a long-term commitment to work with this community long-term on climate change issues, and McNeil would be part of that, but it would be part of a larger suite of building trust and relationship building with this community to talk about broader issues of climate. The next step was for us to bring this back to the public engagement task group, who meets on every other Monday, and we'll meet next Monday to think about whether this fits into the plan that they've developed, and really think about how we would align this work with the work of that group and how we would carry it forward in the light of limited capacity right now, but expectations that hopefully we could have additional capacity in the coming months.
So any initial reaction to that kind of, I think, broader framing and thinking about engaging this community in a more detailed and maybe respectful and longer term way, of which McNeil will be part, but not all of that conversation. So
I'd like to add a little bit, if that's possible.
Yeah.
Jane is spot on with what she said, but we had also discussed the land and the people at great lengths. So the land there has been misused and abused for centuries. Dumps were there that were capped off and are draining into the waterways, into the Intervale. These people were living in urban renewal area in downtown Burlington, and they were pushed to the margins. to live in projects for the most part. And so as Jane said, there's very little trust, because the other big thing is in the 70s, because these people voices were not heard, nor were they asked. There's 2 wastewater treatment facilities right there. One, they're across from each other, one in Winooski and one in Burlington. And every time it rains, it dumps right into their backyards. So there's, as Jane said, there's a lot of mistrust. And it's going to be critical to go slow, and it's going to be critical to not do a one-time thing and think that's it. Relationship is key.
Thank you. Really good context. Questions, comments, thoughts about this approach? Sounds like it's going to work through the public engagement group, but obviously this group would want to be supportive if you are. So Chase, over to you.
Thank you. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to make that call. I was on vacation. I wanted to be there. I guess one question that I have is noting the timeline that this task group is on to try to create recommendations by October, and noting, I guess, that the process of engaging with community members who would be impacted by the decisions of those recommendations is beginning now in the last week or so of August. Is it possible for us to proceed in a way in which we would make recommendations that would in fact incorporate input from impacted communities? Or is the plan at this point to basically just move ahead without input from impacted communities? That's my primary question and concern. I would say that it would be a shame if we created recommendations without input from impacted communities on McNeil.
I mean, I wonder, Chase, at that point, those folks think, I think it may be a little bit of the budget dilemma as well, is that I think that what Judy and Jane in the group talked about, though I wasn't there as well, was, you know, kind of one-off engagement of communities like this that have a long history of exposure in all sorts of ways and distrust is, one, disrespectful in and of itself, and 2, probably not that effective. So I imagine that if we are trying to do some draft recommendations by, you know, September, October, the best we can do is acknowledge our limitations and what we couldn't do or didn't do or haven't done yet. But I think it's hard to imagine how we could look at old testimony or things like that maybe. But I think it may be hard to kind of link these up to at least our short-term timeline. But Judy, go ahead.
I think our recommendation is exactly what Jane said, to build a relationship and to get the research done. And relationships don't occur on a timeline, especially with marginalized people. Also, I have in the past, and I will do so again, offer a tour to anybody in that area that might want one. I was asked to give one the other day by Cheryl, and I did. And I think she found it enlightening to see what we're talking about. So if there's anybody interested, I'd be happy to do that.
That's great, Judy, thank you so much. Chase, over to you.
Thank you. I totally agree with what was described, and Judy, I appreciate. I appreciate you raising it up. I guess what I'm really asking now is the October timeline realistic? That's really my question, because if we're just beginning now with engaging communities and developing relationships of trust, and we're sincere that we want to have relationships and input with community members who are impacted by this decision, it seems like the timeline is just not really compatible with that process. And so my real question, I guess, that I'm asking is, are we on a feasible timeline right now, or do we need to reconsider?
Which is exactly why I asked my question earlier that got put up on the shelf. is how can we continue with budgets and recommendations till we go through the process of forming a recommendation? That's exactly why I asked it.
Billy,
Is it possible to put the conversation regarding the future of the McNeil plant on a different track than the other open questions before this task group? Right, we have, I think, 2 or 3 questions that we've determined are in scope for this group to come back with recommendations on. This conversation is an important one with the McNeil community, but seems like it could be easily separated from the other ones. So that's just a question I put to you all.
and Billy, maybe just to build on that, I think Jane and everything, it would be good, even if we can't draw any broad conclusions about McNeil and Rygrade, I think it would be good for this group to kind of summarize what we think we've learned so far. So we kind of put a finer point on at least where we are today. And then if just adding that friendly amendment, ability, what you said, group, what do you think about potentially doing that, but then trying to come to some conclusion on the broader question of biomass after we have some more presentation and maybe separate out our timelines there a little bit. What do people think about Billy's idea? Is silence a yes, a no, a maybe?
What are the other questions that you're talking about, Billy?
I believe we have a document that went through the tabled actions of recommendations of members of the Ag and Eco subcommittee, parsed those out to which were going to be either addressed by that were already kind of answered by the council through the climate action plan, which have to wait for additional information through life cycle emissions studies that are forthcoming, and that which are right for this group to respond to now. I think one was about the future expansion or operation of the existing biomass plants. One was related to procurement broadly, and there may have been another one.
Jane, do you want any finer point on our scope there, just to remind people?
No, I did put it, Billy was right on, and I put it in the chat there that we worked through earlier. And I think that, yeah, I think by putting something together, it doesn't mean that it has to be conclusive, like drawing like final statements. I think it's really important, but I challenge all of you to tell me otherwise, to try to summarize where we're at, and then try to identify where this group wants to keep going. So what the next steps are, and really try to make it sort of tangible about where the work is going, and draw conclusions where we were able to.
Judy.
I get a little concerned about tabling this and tabling that, because we lose the broader picture of everything together. One impacts the other all the time. And so I think, although we may be moving at a turtle's pace, the turtle wins the race, right? So let's keep it all together and keep plugging away as a bigger picture. Because if you start pulling out all these individual things and waiting for this and waiting for that, you're going to have superficial recommendations.
One thought is I think Jane and I probably would want to encourage you all to form this small drafting group to at least kind of sort of summarize what we think we've learned so far. And we realize we're still learning as we go, right? And that, as Jane said, that doesn't mean we're done. Doesn't mean we'll have definitive recommendations for one or the other. And then to Billy's question, as that group drafts and then brings to this group what we've learned where we are, we can determine whether these all need to be put together, or maybe we can separate out them for timeline, or one has a longer timeline. Maybe that we just don't, maybe we don't quite know yet today, but it's certainly maybe an option on the table, but recognizing the concern Judy has about being integrative. So maybe, Jane, the thing to do is let's talk. I wonder if it's worth talking a little. I think I'm hearing people broadly supportive of the engagement with the community in a respectful and probably longer term and broader way. I think maybe let's talk a little bit about the 9/14 meeting, and then talk about drafting process, and then we'll kind of see where we are with the timing and the timeline and all that here, including the budget. So do you want to describe a little bit what we were thinking about the 9/14 meeting and kind of the folks that you're I think we're inviting or even have already committed to come.
Well, I encourage Chase to help support me in this one too. So, but I have with Dr. Rooney Vara to join us on September 14th, and Chase could probably speak to her research a little better than me, but she is one voice in sort of a more holistic picture of understanding the role of biomass and health implications, as well as and because of her work in Massachusetts and Massachusetts new law, she has some really good context about sort of neighboring states that I think she would bring to that meeting. And then the other two studies, Chase was gracious enough to introduce me to those two professors, and I have not circled back on confirming them yet, and wanted to hear from all of you if those two studies, and Chase, if you're willing, I would appreciate if you would speak to contextually the three different professors on hand and what they would, the different contributions they would make to this group. But those, we could have all of them come, we could have just one, we could read the articles and have a more thoughtful conversation. I would like to hear from all of you about what you want to have presented versus digest independently. And then also know that we've talked about other studies and other voices that Judy's consistently brought up about health impacts, and really want to hear from you on a short timeline if we wanted, and it's not like the be all end all timeline, but if we wanted to ensure that we had as much context as possible to put forward what the next steps are in this space, what are the speakers you want to hear from, knowing now that we have likely the 7th booked up with the presenters from today, and have the 14th as an opportunity to have a 2-hour meeting, and what can that look like. So appreciate, Chase, that you nodded and were willing to fill me in.
Chase, do you want to add a little bit? Then we'll go to Judy after Chase.
Sure, Judy, does that sound good to you? Do you want me to go first, or would you like to ask your question first? Yeah, okay. So Dr. Juliet Rooney Varga is at the University of Massachusetts in Lowell, and recent research that she worked on compares wood biomass greenhouse gas emissions on a life cycle basis to solar and wind and other non-greenhouse gas emission energy sources, which could be helpful because we haven't done that comparison yet in this task group. So far, the comparisons have been between wood biomass, combustion for electricity, and fossil fuels, primarily coal. But of course, in Vermont, we don't really get electricity from coal. The mix is, wind, solar, hydropower, nuclear, about 7% biomass or so. So looking at Juliet Rooney Varga's research could be helpful because it could frame up the comparison and the sort of policy decisions before us, in which we're not really so much contemplating replacing coal with biomass, but rather we're comparing biomass to nuclear, wind, solar, hydropower, things like that. So her research could speak to that, and it would be unique, the first of its kind, I think, that this task group has considered in my review of the materials. Dr. Jerome Langonier is a Canadian researcher who did a life cycle greenhouse gas accounting study that compared large biomass electricity generation facilities, which I think could be helpful because, as far as I'm aware, most of the research that we've gone into have not been specific to those large facilities like the ones we're contemplating here. Dr. Buchholz was considering wood pellet stoves, for example, in the life cycle assessment that he did. So it'd be more topical. And the comparison there is between large biomass facilities and natural gas, coal, and oil facilities used to generate electricity, which although only a portion of Vermont's electricity comes from the ISO New England mix, of which about 53.5% or so is from natural gas. At least then the comparison with natural gas would be sort of helpful. So to the extent we wanted to look at that, that's out there. It can provide some additional context. Dr. Bonacore, who was just until I think a couple of weeks ago at the Harvard T.H. Chan School, recently moved to Boston University, I believe. A couple of years ago, conducted a study evaluating the emissions emissions that are relevant to human health, such as fine particulate matter, ozone, from the major energy sources in the United States, and compared those emissions from wood biomass, coal, natural gas, the major energy sources, and compiles all that information so that there's a national view, but then also looks at the view from each of the states, including Vermont. So we can get an assessment of where does the bulk of the fine particulate matter and ozone come from our energy sources here in the state of Vermont. So it just helps to inform the human health discussion and places it in sort of a larger statewide and national context.
Thanks, Chase. Judy.
So I don't believe I've missed any meetings at the Ag and Ecosystem or at this meeting. And at all of the meetings have been some really knowledgeable people who sit and wait to the very end for a 2-minute comment. And I keep thinking it would be great to hear from people who know the forest, like Zach Porter or Cheryl or Annette. Those people have things to say and we give them 2 minutes at the end, right? And Cheryl's been on many occasions recommending someone named Dr. Muma and someone named Dr. Sturman. And so I think we need to start, I do learn from the people who are presenting about what's new, what's the greatest, what's to replace this with. I still want to hear from that perspective, that untold story that they get to talk about for 2 minutes at the end of each meeting. I want to hear more about that.
So Judy, one thing I have is I want to have some discussion about what Jane and Chase just presented in terms of potential presenters for the 14th. And then if the group is willing, given Annette's comment in chat, maybe we take we get a bit of a public comment in here before we talk about drafting. So if we could have a little bit more discussion among the group members first, and then I think if the group's willing, I turn it over to some comment from Annette about a recent point that you just made. So is depending on availability, if Jane tries to track down, Juliet's already confirmed, Dr. Jerome we'll see, and then the Bonacore study, again, see what we can get. If we can get 2 to 3 presenters, I think we can put it all into one meeting. Are people okay with trying to track those 2 additional folks down? Anybody have a concern about that? 2 are more related to kind of the broader question of biomass. The Bonacore study is a little bit more related to the health impacts we've tried to cover to some extent, but it would give us that broader context, as Chase said. Anybody have a concern about that? And if not, Jane will try to pursue people to see what we can get.
Well, we've already heard about health impacts from one person. And when I took the data that person presented and went to the CDC, it told a different story.
And Judy, is that something to that point, forget about presenters for a second, is that work that you did, has that been discussed with the full group yet? Because we may need to add that into a future discussion.
Oh, yeah, it's been extended each week.
Okay.
So.
Well, I guess the question is, Chase, given, that's specific obviously to health effects and impacts on Rygate and McNeil, but I don't know whether the Bonacore study would give at least a broader perspective, Chase, to help inform that conversation as well.
It provides context for the discussion of where do these pollutants come from, where it provides a base of knowledge there. And so to that extent, yes, it's helpful. As far as, what is the human health impact from breathing those in over time, I think that is not covered in the study explicitly. And if that's something that we wanted to learn more about, we should probably invite a medical doctor and to speak with us.
Well, that's exactly what I did. I went to the community health center to ask where their data is stored, and they said it was at the CDC. When I tracked it down with the CDC, I found that yes, indeed, the numbers were lower, but so were the ages. So hospital visits from COPD was around 35 years old. Now it's around 20. And hospital visits from asthma attacks was around 27 years old, and now it's 10-year-olds who are going to the hospital with asthma attacks. That's pretty severe.
I mean, well, again, this is something for the drafting group and this full group to discuss. I don't know how far we've gotten. You know, the question is, does there need to be further epidemiological work around these plants, particularly McNeil with more concentrated populations, to kind of suss out in more detail some of the, specifically, Judy, some of the questions or concerns you just raised. And that could be a recommendation, right? If you also wanted it to be. Okay, so is it, I'm not hearing anybody object to these presenters to learn more. I guess, is it okay, group? Annette wanted to make a specific comment, I think, to Dr. Juliet Varga. So is that okay? After Liz, I'll have you go first. And if the group's okay, I'll let Annette kind of comment to that presenter. But Liz, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I didn't need to go before Annette, but I maybe speaking on something. Yeah, maybe this is something related to what she's going to say. I am happy to hear from the speakers mentioned, and just from my own perspective, it feels like the important thing for this group would be to have some understanding of the relative greenhouse gas emissions and other emissions, frankly, particulates, et cetera, of all sources, without yet perhaps getting into the comparison of what is displaced and when, because it can be incredibly complex, as you know, I think many on this meeting have worked on and know, in terms of how a source is utilized on the grid, whether it's tied to the particular renewable portfolio standard of a state, which requires the attribute to be tied to a specific, energy unit actually delivered regionally, even though it may not count within the state if the owner of that resource uses it out of state. And without going way down a sidetrack in terms of what specifically McNeil or Rygate or any other source for that matter might displace in any given moment or on a yearly basis, it feels like to me the right thing to do is just simply to have the information across sources. So to kind of tie it up to what Chase said, and then maybe lead into what Annette's going to comment on based on the chat. It feels like if we've had a focus thus far on, electric biomass versus fossil fuel sources, oil, natural gas, coal, having that same kind of analysis with the other sources is fine to do, as long as we then kind of take all of that information and think about it as we make the recommendations, rather than draw conclusions up front about which is, more particularly displacing a particular resource here. I'll stop there.
No, and as we look at it from a systems perspective, Liz, I think you're asking, it gets really, really complicated, but at least you got to put this all in context. So we're taking it in bits and pieces. Give Annette a moment just to speak to one of the speakers, Annette, I think the group's okay with that. So turn it over to you to make a comment.
Yes, what Liz just said. I mean, are we talking about contracts? Are we talking about rec sales? Are we talking about electrons? So thank you, Liz. I was going to say, maybe you'll have something to add to this, but that is a very oversimplified and not helpful description in that. I wouldn't say it's biased. I just say that it doesn't get to the issues. However, I guess the part of it, if you could ask the doctor to adapt her presentation, and maybe it's in it, I know nothing about her, but relevant to this subcommittee or task group is the specifics on how greenhouse gas emissions are accounted for biomass. That's kind of at the core of one of the major issues that this group is looking at. And since it's not, since CO2 isn't counted in Vermont, CO2 isn't counted a lot of places. And so that piece, I think, would be very helpful to revise the description to include that discussion. So thank you for letting me speak out of turn.
Jane, do you have any questions for Annette about that request about GHG accounting? No. Okay, so I think we can forward that to the speaker and see what she's able to do. And thank you. And thank you, Liz, both, I think, for the point about putting the broad context of electricity systems we need to think about overall. And that how we actually discharge electricity and the complicated way it's done through NEPOOL and all that is a complicated story. Chase.
Yeah, thanks. I totally agree that it's important to have the full context and to look fulsomely across all the different energy generation sources and compare them holistically. So that makes sense. And I think that was the spirit and the intent behind getting information that makes that comparison to wind and solar and other zero greenhouse gas emission sources, since that comparison just hadn't been done yet. And since Vermont has greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements, it seemed relevant. I just wanted to lift up that Professor Rooney Varga could likely speak to that type of greenhouse gas emissions accounting. She's been published in that area multiple times, I believe. But I heard Judy mention Professor John Sturman, who's at MIT, and also Professor Bill Muma, who is at Tufts. They have both also been published in this area a lot and are leading voices nationally and internationally on the subject. So to the extent we wanted to, and I realize we're running short on time, and suggesting other speakers is likely not helpful from a time perspective. But to the extent we did want to dig into that, those two speakers would probably be among the best we could ask.
Chase, if you have a bio or a little bit of blurb on John from the doctor from MIT, that might be helpful. And full disclosure, Bill is on my board, so so we can get Bill's bio quite easily too if need be. But okay, so I think we've got some stuff lined up for the 14th. We're rescheduling the one today. We have some additional potential folks we might try to fit in somewhere. We'll have to kind of look at their bios and think about that. And we ask for kind of some accounting of GHG conversation from Dr. Rooney Varga as we go. And again, that we may need some other context around broader electricity systems too. I'm not sure, but Jane, go ahead.
No, I just want to lift up one more time the link to the presentations from Yale. Dr. Bill Muma is on that. There's a lot of other good presentations that speak to many of the comments we're hearing. It's not the same as necessarily inviting them in, but it is really helpful. So.
And Jane, just remind us, was that a link to a conference or something where we've got recordings? Is that the idea?
They put on a year-long series of inviting people in to speak about biomass and larger implications. So it's, and I've dropped it in the chat, I'll list it up again, but it's, yeah, it's about the changing climate, specifically climate change and energy and biomass. So encourage folks to look at it.
Chase, over to you. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we start beginning to at least capture drafting what we've learned so far, but recognize we have a lot more potentially to learn. Chase, go ahead.
I'm sorry, that might be a phantom hand.
Oh, okay.
Let me lower that. Pardon me.
Vestigial hand, no worries. So let's say, I think we've got some additional potential ideas here. We have so much to learn and time and limited time to do it. And so we'll have to continue to think about how we balance that. But I think we've got at least the shorter term lined up. So here's the thought, and Jane is going to say a little bit more, is that we think it'd be helpful to capture what we've learned so far. And we're kind of learning as we're trying to capture what we're learning, we're also still learning, we recognize that. Thanks, Chase, for that bio. So what we're hoping is a small group we could pull together to start drafting, starting first on McNeil and Reigate, because we've had some focus there. We're still in the process of some of these larger questions that have been raised, and try to say, what have we learned so far? What are our findings in summary that this group could agree to, that we could forward to the Climate Council? Again, those may not be final, right? They may be, here's what we're learning so far, and we have a lot more to learn. But we just want to try to, we've done so much work and we haven't quite begun to gel it in a way that we can see if the group says, yes, that's my understanding of what we've learned. So we thought it'd be helpful to have a small drafting group work to kind of draft findings, short, not long and extensive, and then bring them to the full group for discussion. And then obviously this would be forwarded to the Climate Council, and we want to give them some kind of update at least in October. Again, recognizing that's tied back to the budget timing question that got raised. So Jane, do you want to say a bit more about our thoughts about that process? See if the group has any questions or comments, and then we'll go from there.
No, I think you did a good job of summarizing it. I do think we need to really make space after September 14th to have the focus of this task group be publicly vetting whatever we want to communicate through either final recommendations or process going forward to get there for October at the council meeting. I don't think that those have to be final for October's council meeting, but just a reminder that that is the expectation is that the focus of that council meeting will be on what this task group has learned to date and what is looking like is the recommendations or process coming out of here for future work. So yeah, so we're on it's getting a tighter timeline just to think about how we want to communicate up to the council what this task group has been up to this past 6 months or so.
So Jane, you want to just describe who we were thinking as is maybe been willing to put a little time into the drafting group, and again, everything will come to the full group here, right? So you're not on the drafting group means you don't, you're going to see everything and have plenty of equal time to comment and reflect the findings. But Jane, you want to describe a little bit who we were thinking?
Well, yes, I'm happy to do that, and then would really like to hear everyone's input. One of the values of having this be a task group, just a reminder, is that we can actually share things over email and communicate drafts with the whole task group. There's not open meeting law governing that. So if we wanted to take the first shot at a draft that is then vetted in a public meeting over email with the whole group, there's nothing that says we can't do that. So I just want to put that out there. But we had wanted to think about cross-representation from ag, eco, just transitions, and science and data to bring different voices and expertise around the different issues within the scope we were looking at, and had suggested that Charlie, who hasn't been able to join us recently, but is willing to help really with his expertise around forestry, and then making that a broader connection to the work of biomass and keeping forest. So Charlie, Judy, Richard, who sits on the science and data subcommittee and brings that technical expertise, and then Chase has volunteered to help us draft that with respect to the just transitions perspective, as well as his capacity and legal expertise in helping draft things would be great.
That was
again, this is just to get to a rough draft that would then be discussed wholeheartedly in a task group.
And that's kind of our thought. And then we'd put a little more burden on them to do some of that work, but then obviously you're going to see everything in draft and discussion. And for folks who come to these meetings, you'll see all this too as we discuss, and we'll have a chance to comment as well. So any questions about that process? And if not, we'll try to get that instituted relatively soon to get going. Okay, so let me turn back to budget briefly. So I think it's going to be hard for us to come conclusively to any broad budget recommendations, given all of the work that we did. And Cheryl, you didn't miss public comment, so there's still time. Don't worry. So on the budget question, I think as the drafting group thinks a little bit of finding if there's budget implications in the short term, we land upon quickly, like maybe support for further engagement with community or something else. Let's raise those, and we'll just kind of keep that on our radar the next few times, recognizing for the particular initial deadline, we're not likely to meet it, but we'll keep that in mind. We'll keep in mind the drafting group as we think about drafting the findings, to what degree we can conclude things, to what degrees we can't, whether we stay all together on a timeline and have just process recommendations beyond October for this group, or can separate tracks, as Billy maybe suggested as an option. Again, another thing for us to think about too. And then obviously trying to put this all in the context broadly about what, carbon and electricity generation broadly. We need to, as Liz and Annette reminded us, we have to continue to think about how this kind of sits in that big context of which this is just a part of the story. And there's a little bit in chat that even gives that further reflection. So we're going to kind of try to be crafting what we're finding so far as we continue to learn. We recognize that's a little bit of a dual track, but we just think we need to do that to kind of get work done. And we don't want to lose collectively the wisdom and findings of this group as we go, because sometimes everything just kind of jumbles together. We don't put stuff in writing. So that's the intent of the drafting group. Okay, I want to turn it over to public comment now. I think we've covered what we can for today. But anything, any other comments from this group before I turn to public comment? Okay, anybody wants to make a public comment, just raise your hand and then I'll call in. Cheryl, you're up.
Okay, hi, everyone, thanks. Sorry, I just ran. So what I want to say is that it's really important, I believe, to hear from not just Juliette Rudy Varga, but several other people before you make any recommendations or decisions. And I think that logging up or writing up what you've already learned is very skewed because you haven't heard from every side of this issue. You haven't heard about a lot of things. To hear from Dr. Muma and Dr. Sturman, and hear from more from Annette, from Rachel Smoker, from Zach. These are important things to hear about. The thing is that you're focusing just on one thing and also not hearing the whole story from it and looking at some, even Bill Keaton. I think a lot of people missed the fact that in Bill Keaton's research and data that he showed, the answer was you came away with not the thing that really was the way to slow and stop greenhouse gases, carbon emissions. So it's really skewed. And I think the beginning, 3 months of this task group was mostly focused on not doing what the task group was originally planned to do. It was trying to change the scope. So then finally you got down to business really a short time ago. And I think that you need to continue the work and hear from the other side. So the transportation task group has been working every week and they have recommendations. They're done now. But, if you want to really get the work done by the time of October, I don't know, is it mid-October? Then, perhaps think about meeting every week so that you can have these other speakers and hear the other side of it and not hear only from people with vested interests, not only hear from people who are answering to the forest products lobby or industry, not hear only from people who have a vested interest. So you have to think about what your goal is. And the other thing is that greenhouse gases, as I've said many times, is not the only issue here. Carbon isn't the only issue. If we mitigate the climate change issue, then and don't pay attention, and it makes worse the water issues and the biodiversity issues, then we're not solving the problem. You can't do that. You can't stop carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions and not address and then make biodiversity worse and continue to have worse storm events because of, well, I won't go into the details. Anyway, you have to look at more than that. So it's important to my suggestion is to meet weekly and get the rest of the people in here to hear the other side of the story and to hear the other views and people who are without an interest. And that's my recommendation. Thanks.
Thanks, Cheryl. Annette.
Good morning again. I have 3 comments. I believe at the last meeting, I made a request for the data for wood sourcing for McNeil and Biomass and Reigate and the states that they come from. Has that been produced and will it be produced? Because I haven't seen it.
Yeah, the Reigate one was produced and I posted it with that meeting and I'm still waiting on the BED one because I neglected to ask them specifically.
I don't
I'll put it
find
in the chat. It's
under
on the website.
resources, then I find it on the page for that meeting. Okay, I was looking under the resources tab where I thought things got posted.
And Jane, just to be clear, we have Rygates, but not McNeil's. Is that what you just said? Okay.
Thank you for following up on that. I haven't attended a Just Transitions subcommittee meeting in a long time, primarily because I was kind of forced out. I mean, I wasn't included. I had asked to be included in either their stakeholder group or focus group because I have a fair amount of experience with public engagement, and I just wasn't included. But I understand that, and I may be wrong, but I understand that they abandoned this practice of only letting people speak under public comment, especially the people who regularly attend. So I just offer that, and if that's being done in another subcommittee, there are just a handful of us who are attending every one of these meetings, and it might make for a less frustrating process for some of us to be able to speak on the topics at the time rather than saving things up till the end. It just seems like at the end of the day, we end up taking up more time because we have to combine everything into one at the end. I do have some experience in I'm thinking about the idea of how one accumulates information about health effects. And I've done this with neighbors of wind turbines, and I've done this with the users of the Champlain Water District who got sick when the system switched from chlorine to chloramine as a secondary disinfectant. And in one instance, EPA and CDC were coming to Vermont and said they did not want to hear from the people who were suffering. And I pushed back and I asked for an hour to make a presentation, and we were given 30 minutes. And so this involved a citizens group in the Chittenden County area who had by then gathered 200 or 300 complaints from people. And we were given a specific day and time. We were given 30 minutes on a Wednesday at 3 o'clock, which kind of meant we didn't get parents or children. We got old people who, but that's what we ended up with. And we got a dozen people. And so I called every one of them. I interviewed them. And then they all came to the public forum. And I apologized to them in advance and said, sorry, this is going to be kind of wham bam and get out of there. But I asked each one of them the same set of questions. We got through it in, I think, 33 minutes. I think it was incredibly effective because nothing was scripted. Everybody just spoke in response to the same set of questions about what their experience were, why they thought the water was making them sick. So there are ways of doing this in an efficient way that and I'm not familiar with whatever is being discussed behind the scenes, but the first thing is to identify who has something to say and then help them say it. And I found this to be true also with the neighbors of the wind turbines, where we had actually put together a similar presentation for the PUC, which they canceled at the last minute. And instead it forced everybody to have to go up and speak for 3 minutes in a microphone, which is incredibly intimidating. It's probably one of the hardest things that the public has to do. So creating a forum in which people are comfortable speaking, and I found that people are very happy to answer my questions, and they're much, even if there is an audience that is intimidating, if they're just talking to me or somebody like me, then it helps them to be more forthcoming. So just wanted to offer that. I'm not saying I need to be involved, but I'm just saying that there are ways of doing this to encourage people's voices who otherwise aren't trusting or feeling as though they are wanting to be heard. So thank you.
And that if you have, do you have any short write-up of that methodology? Like it's a paragraph or something, just so
I have all the videos of these different people speaking for 30 minutes or in a 30-minute period, but I can write something up if you want.
I think a paragraph would be helpful. Maybe we would forward it to the public engagement group. Maybe that's a tool to use with the community. So if just a short methods would be really helpful.
Sure, do that.
Cheryl, I think a comment, and then I'll go to back to the group, Judy included. So Cheryl.
Yeah, sorry about that. It's true what Annette said about having to all, gather up all your comments over time for one thing, and then you miss things. So a couple of things that I missed was you were talking about the emissions from the stacks at McNeil and Rygate and how they're impacting the communities of people. which is very important and, of paramount import. But additionally, the communities of non-human individuals are also important. So even if the emissions are going not into a neighborhood, but into like a wetland or a forest or, riparian area, those are also important emissions. And when they're affecting other individuals that aren't human, this is also important. The other thing is that I'm not sure if it's really appropriate for this very time, but I don't ever hear any of the groups or task groups talking about reduction in consumption. And I think that that has to be part of the conversation and part of all the conversations. And really nothing is coming out about that. Or if maybe not nothing, but a very small amount. And it really actually ought to be at the top of the list for looking at things to do. So, that has to do with the energy use and, the biomass plants and all of that as well. So those are the two things that I can think of now that I forgot before.
Well, thank you,
Thanks.
Cheryl. And let me go back to the group as we close, but I'll put a pitch for Judy has been emphasizing lower consumption for a long time. So I just want to give her credit. She has not raised that issue. So Judy, over to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's for sure. Talking about the things that are non-human that Cheryl mentioned, both of these places are highly sensitive archaeologically. And McNeil is on the state historical register as the most archaeologically sensitive site in the state. So that's something to consider as well, especially since they're talking about expanding. And I wanted to just comment on Annette's comments about surveys. I have never in my life made out a survey because making out a survey is what got my family targeted by the Vermont Eugenics Survey as the largest family targeted. And I was raised under the philosophy, fools' names and fools' faces are often found in public places. Only a fool would put their face or their name in a public place. And my family came from that neighborhood. So I agree with what Annette's saying. There has to be the personal contact of someone that they feel comfortable to talk with. Even if it is in a survey format, it still has to be presented in a personal way so that people will feel comfortable to speak, otherwise they won't. Thank you.
And then, Judy, I think that raises back to your earlier point about this community, and very careful engagement is important because of a long history. So, okay, so I think we will pull together the drafting group and begin to work, recognizing some limitations people have raised, and we won't be done yet. I think we've got some speakers that will, I don't know, try to lock in blood or something so they are there, and then we'll try to reschedule what we missed today. And we've got some other names in the mix too. We'll try to do some thinking about to see if we can get in the time that we're doing work right now. Jane, anything else to wrap up for today?
No, this is really helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Cheryl just asked on the if she had raised the issue, should we meet every week? And we're meeting every other week right now, Jane, currently, is that correct?
Yeah, well, yes. Although we have 2 back-to-back meetings now scheduled in September, the 7th and 14th, to address what we weren't able to do today.
So yeah, Cheryl, we
have a week off next week.
Right. We've met your interest partly because we all are kind of get our drafting group together soon. Then we're going to meet this group at least twice. So rather than try to discuss that further today, let's kind of see where we land on the 14th of September. And the group can certainly take up whether we, need to meet more regularly in September, early October to continue our work. So point noted, and I guess to some degree we are meeting in soon actually in a row to kind of get things moving. All right, group, thank you so much. Thanks, consistent attendees of the public, and look forward to kind of furthering on our learning as well as beginning to pen to paper a little bit of what we've learned so far as we go. All right, so we'll see you all in 2 weeks, and Jane will get out a Jane, you'll get a calendar invite. Once we confirm the speakers, we'll get a calendar invite for that, the week of the 7th, right? Or whatever that is.
Yeah, well, I'll put a placeholder in for that now.
Perfect. Okay, great. All right. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
Bye, everyone.
Have a nice
Thanks,
day.
bye-bye.